Racist cop tackles black woman until the silent alert she triggers revokes his authority across all divisions. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's return to our main character, Alicia Carter, and the moment that quietly changed everything. Alicia stood beneath the humming glow of a municipal streetlight, the kind that buzzed faintly and made the night feel colder than it really was. Her shoulders squared and her expression calm, as if she were waiting for a bus rather than standing in the shadow of a badge. Officer Daniel Reeves saw her before he heard her. A lone figure he decided didn't belong where she stood. And that decision settled over him with the certainty of habit. To the onlookers nearby, the scene looked ordinary, almost forgettable. A uniform moving with purpose and a woman being told to stay where she was. Yet there was a tension in the air that felt heavier than the humid evening. Daniel's voice carried authority, clipped and practiced, the sound of someone who believed the rules traveled with him wherever he went. And as he closed the distance, he acted as though the outcome had already been written. Alicia did not raise her voice or plead her case. She did not reach for witnesses or explanations. She kept her hands visible and her breathing steady, eyes forward, as if she understood that noise would only serve the moment he wanted. The crowd shifted, phones half lifted and then lowered again, uncertainty spreading like a quiet ripple, while Daniel's confidence grew, fed by the stillness he mistook for submission. He spoke in assumptions and conclusions, each word tightening the space around her, and for a brief instant it seemed as though the night itself leaned toward his side. What Daniel could not see was the discipline in Alicia's restraint, the kind that comes from knowing when silence speaks louder than argument. There was a small movement, almost imperceptible, a subtle press of her thumb against the inside of her wrist where nothing appeared to be. An action so minimal it vanished into the glare of the light. No alarms sounded, no sirens rose, and nothing about the scene suggested that anything had changed. Yet the air shifted all the same. Daniel continued as if uninterrupted, convinced the badge on his chest answered every question, unaware that somewhere beyond the block, beyond the bystanders and the glow of the streetlight, systems had begun to stir. Alicia remained composed, her posture unchanged, carrying herself with a quiet dignity that unsettled those watching more than any protest could have. She understood that the moment was not about winning an argument but about letting time reveal the truth he was so certain he controlled. As minutes stretched, Daniel's radio crackled with static and then fell silent, a detail he dismissed with a frown, while Alicia waited, eyes steady, knowing that authority built on assumption has a way of unraveling without warning. In that pause, before anyone could name what felt different, the balance of power began to tilt, not with force or spectacle, but with a silence that traveled faster than any shouted command. Alicia remained exactly where she was as the night pressed in around the small stretch of sidewalk, the streetlight above casting a pale circle that felt more like a boundary than illumination. And within that circle the imbalance of power was unmistakable. Officer Daniel Reeves filled the space with practiced authority, his uniform crisp, his boots planted shoulder-width apart, every detail of his posture shaped by years of being deferred to without question. The badge on his chest caught the light with every slight movement, a symbol that signaled to everyone nearby who was meant to be believed and who was expected to comply. To Daniel, the situation felt routine, another moment where order would be restored simply by asserting it. And his confidence came not from the facts in front of him but from the system that had always responded when he spoke. The bystanders sensed it too. The way conversations fell quiet. The way people instinctively stepped back a few feet, creating an invisible perimeter that left Alicia standing alone while Daniel occupied the center. It was the kind of scene that played out across cities every night. Familiar enough that most people barely registered it, yet heavy enough that those inside it felt the weight. Immediately, Alicia understood that weight intimately. Not as fear but as awareness. An understanding of how quickly assumptions hardened into judgments once a uniform took control of the narrative. She stood with her shoulders relaxed, hands open, her breathing slow and deliberate, refusing to mirror the tension that Daniel projected. Her calm unsettled him more than resistance ever could, because calm did not fit the script he expected. And without realizing it, he leaned harder into his authority to compensate. He spoke again, louder this time, his words measured but edged with certainty, as if volume alone could erase any doubt about who belonged and who did not. The radios on nearby offices' belts murmured faintly in the distance, reminders of a network that usually responded instantly. And Daniel took comfort in that background noise. A constant reassurance that he was supported even when standing alone. Alicia listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable, not defiant but not diminished either. And in that stillness she appeared less like someone being confronted and more like someone observing a process unfold. Around them, the night air carried the distant sound of traffic and the occasional siren blocks away. Ordinary city noises that made the moment feel suspended between significance and anonymity. Daniel gestured once, sharply, a motion meant to signal compliance rather than conversation. And for a brief second the crowd seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether Alicia would move. She did not. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly, grounding herself, aware that the rules governing this encounter were written long before either of them arrived at this spot. The power imbalance was not just between two people but embedded in the environment itself, reinforced by uniforms, by silence, by the assumption that authority always flowed in one direction. Daniel mistook her stillness for hesitation, perhaps even guilt, and that assumption strengthened his resolve, convincing him that control was already secured. What he did not recognize was that control based solely on perception is fragile, dependent on everyone continuing to believe the same story. Alicia's composure did not challenge him openly, but it quietly resisted being defined by his expectations. And in doing so it exposed the tension at the heart of the moment. The system Daniel trusted so completely was already shifting beyond his awareness, its response moving through channels he could not see, while he remained focused on the narrow frame in front of him. Under the streetlight, the roles appeared fixed, the outcome seemingly decided. Yet beneath that surface, the balance was beginning to change, not with confrontation or noise, but with patience and an understanding of how power truly moves. Alicia's calm presence began to take on a different weight as the seconds passed. Not louder or more visible, but heavier in the way silence can fill a room when no one dares to interrupt it. She was aware of every small detail around her. The hum of the streetlight, the faint vibration of traffic moving several blocks away, the subtle shift in the crowd as people adjusted their stance without realizing why. To anyone watching casually, she might have appeared passive, but there was intention in her stillness, a discipline shaped by experience rather than instinct. Officer Daniel Reeves continued to speak, his tone firm and procedural, leaning on phrases that sounded official enough to discourage questions. And yet something about the exchange no longer flowed as smoothly as it had moments earlier. Alicia listened with an expression that never hardened, never softened, as though she were measuring time rather than words. She knew that moments like this often tempted people to explain themselves, to fill the air with reassurance or fear. But she also knew that explanations offered too early could be used to frame a story that was not hers. Her focus remained inward, steady, while outwardly she appeared compliant, grounded, and unshaken. Daniel noticed the lack of reaction and interpreted it through the lens he trusted most, assuming it meant uncertainty or resignation. And that assumption allowed him to relax just enough to miss what mattered. The balance of the scene remained tilted toward him, yet it no longer felt as absolute as it had before, and that subtle change registered as irritation rather than caution. He adjusted his stance and glanced briefly toward the street, expecting the familiar reassurance of immediate support, but the sounds around him remained ordinary, almost muted. Alicia shifted her gaze slightly, not to challenge him, but to acknowledge the space beyond him, as if she were aware of movement he could not see. Her hands stayed visible, relaxed, her posture composed, conveying a quiet confidence that did not need to announce itself. The crowd sensed it too, a barely perceptible pause settling over the group. Conversations fully stopped now, eyes fixed on the interaction with a curiosity that felt different from before. This was no longer just about compliance or command. It was about observation, about waiting to see which version of authority would reveal itself. Daniel continued to rely on the visible symbols of his role, the uniform, the badge, the expectations that usually followed him without resistance, unaware that those symbols depended on recognition to hold their power. Alicia understood that recognition could shift, sometimes without warning, and she trusted the process unfolding beyond the immediate frame. She did not rush it. She allowed the moment to breathe, knowing that patience often unsettled those accustomed to control. Her calm was not defiance, but it was not surrender either. It was something more deliberate, a refusal to let fear dictate her presence. As time stretched, Daniel's certainty began to feel slightly performative, his authority asserted rather than assumed, and that distinction mattered. Alicia remained composed, her expression neutral, her attention anchored, as if she were standing at the center of a quiet current moving steadily beneath the surface. In that stillness, she was not simply enduring the moment but shaping it, allowing the imbalance to expose itself without confrontation. The night held its breath around them, and although nothing outwardly dramatic had changed, the foundation of the interaction had begun to shift, guided not by force or volume, but by a measured understanding of when to speak and when to remain silent. The tension that had been quietly building now began to surface in subtle but unmistakable ways as Officer Daniel Reeves leaned further into his role, his voice growing sharper, more deliberate, each word shaped to remind everyone watching that he was the one in control. He spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to having the final say, relying on tone and posture to command the space. And the crowd responded instinctively by pulling back another step, creating a wider circle that placed Alicia Carter at its center. To Daniel, the widening distance felt like validation, proof that authority was working exactly as it should, and he mistook the shifting energy for compliance rather than scrutiny. Alicia felt the change as well, not as pressure but as clarity, understanding that public moments like this often revealed more about the person exerting power than the one receiving it. She remained steady, her expression composed, allowing Daniel's assumptions to speak for themselves. His words grew more pointed, layered with implications that required no explicit explanation to be understood, and a few onlookers exchanged glances, uncertain whether they were witnessing routine enforcement or something crossing an invisible line. Alicia did not respond to the tone, did not mirror the edge in his voice, and that contrast only seemed to push him further, as if her refusal to react challenged the authority he expected to be absolute. He adjusted his stance again, squaring his shoulders, making sure his badge caught the light, and addressed her as though the outcome were already decided. The imbalance was now unmistakable. Not just between two individuals but between a narrative being imposed and a truth waiting to emerge. Alicia's calm began to feel conspicuous. Not because it was loud, but because it did not fit the escalating scene. And that mismatch unsettled those watching more than raised voices ever could. A phone lifted somewhere in the crowd. Then another. The quiet glow of screens reflecting a growing awareness that this moment mattered beyond the sidewalk. Daniel noticed but dismissed it, assuming that visibility favored him. Unaware that visibility without control can quickly become exposure. Alicia remained focused, her attention inward, her movements minimal, as if conserving energy rather than engaging in a contest of wills. She understood that escalation often fed on reaction, and by offering none, she allowed the situation to reveal its own imbalance. Daniel's confidence began to take on a brittle quality. His authority asserted repeatedly rather than assumed, and the repetition itself hinted at strain. The night air felt heavier, the ordinary sounds of the city receding as the crowd's attention narrowed to the exchange. Unfolding under the streetlight, Alicia's silence did not erase the tension. It concentrated it, forcing everyone present to confront what they were witnessing without distraction. Daniel continued, framing his words as procedure, as necessity, as order. Yet each phrase seemed to push the moment closer to a point where explanation would no longer suffice. Alicia met his gaze calmly, not challenging, not yielding, simply present. And in that presence there was a quiet dignity that resisted being defined by his narrative. The imbalance reached its peak not through action but through perception. As the crowd collectively sensed that something fundamental was off, that authority was being performed rather than upheld. Daniel pressed forward, convinced that control was maintained by persistence, while Alicia waited, understanding that escalation often precedes collapse. In that charged stillness, the scene shifted from routine to revealing, exposing the fragile line between power exercised and power questioned, and setting the stage for consequences that had already begun moving beyond Daniel's awareness. By the time the moment reached what felt like its sharpest edge, Alicia Carter had already made the smallest decision of the night, one so subtle that even those standing within a few feet of her would never have noticed it if they had been looking directly at her hands. Her posture did not change. Her expression remained calm, and her eyes stayed level. But beneath that still exterior, intention moved with precision. The streetlight hummed steadily overhead, and the air felt thick with expectation, as if the space itself were waiting for something to arrive. Officer Daniel Reeves continued to speak, his tone firm, procedural, layered with confidence that relied more on habit than on awareness. And he failed to notice the brief pause in his radio's background chatter. A silence so ordinary it registered as nothing at all. Alicia's thumb rested lightly where it had been before, a natural position that drew no attention. Yet the pressure she applied was deliberate, measured, and brief, the kind of action designed to disappear the moment it was completed. There was no sound, no visible signal, no outward indication that anything had been activated. And that was precisely the point. The power of the action lay in its invisibility, in the fact that it did not disrupt the scene but quietly extended beyond it. Alicia released the pressure and returned her hand to stillness, her breathing unchanged, her presence steady, trusting the system she had engaged to do exactly what it was designed to do. Around her, the crowd remained focused on Daniel, watching his gestures, listening to his words, assuming that whatever mattered most was happening within the circle of light. Daniel continued uninterrupted, unaware that the story he believed he controlled had already begun to move past him. The night carried on with its ordinary sounds. Distant engines, a door closing somewhere down the block, the faint murmur of voices further away, all of it unchanged. reinforcing the illusion that nothing significant had occurred. Alicia did not look at her wrist or check for confirmation. She did not need to. Her calm was not based on hope but on certainty. The kind that comes from understanding how systems respond once they are set in motion. Daniel shifted his weight again and spoke as if to finalize the exchange. His words carrying the expectation of compliance. Yet something in the air felt different now. Less tense but more focused. As though the moment had crossed an unseen threshold. A few people in the crowd glanced at one another, sensing the shift without being able to name it, while Daniel remained fixed on the visible symbols of his authority, assuming they were as solid as they had always been. Alicia met his gaze briefly, not to challenge him but to acknowledge the space they shared. And then she looked forward again, content to wait. She understood that the most effective actions often appear unremarkable at the moment they occur, their impact unfolding elsewhere, out of sight, beyond the awareness of those who believe themselves untouchable. Time continued its steady pace, seconds passing without drama, and Daniel spoke on, confident that control was maintained through persistence. What he did not know was that the silent decision Alicia had made moments earlier was already echoing through channels far beyond the sidewalk, moving through systems that did not rely on volume or intimidation, systems that responded not to posture but to protocol. In that quiet continuation, the scene remained outwardly unchanged, yet its outcome had been irrevocably set, shaped by an action so small it blended seamlessly into stillness, waiting for the moment when its presence could no longer be ignored. The moment stretched into an uneasy calm that felt almost deceptive, as if the scene had settled into a pause meant to reassure rather than warn. Officer Daniel Reeves stood with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already secured. His posture relaxed just enough to suggest control rather than urgency. To him, the lack of resistance confirmed his assumptions, reinforcing the idea that authority did not need to rush when it was unquestioned. The crowd lingered, no longer edging backward, yet not moving closer either, suspended in a shared uncertainty that had replaced the earlier tension. Alicia Carter remained composed, her presence steady and unremarkable to anyone not paying close attention. And that was exactly how she intended it. She understood that after an unseen action, the most important thing was patience, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. The streetlight continued its quiet hum, the glow flattening shadows and giving the scene a strange sense of normalcy. As if nothing about this interaction would be worth remembering, Daniel spoke again, his words less sharp now, more procedural, signaling that he believed the encounter was nearing its conclusion. He glanced briefly at his radio, expecting the familiar background confirmation that always followed, but the absence of sound did not concern him. Radios glitched, moments passed, and authority endured. Alicia noticed the glance and then the subtle flicker of irritation that crossed his face when the reassurance he expected did not arrive, and she recognized it as the first sign of doubt, faint but real. She did not acknowledge it outwardly, keeping her attention forward, trusting that the silence would do its work without her involvement. The crowd sensed the shift as well, though no one spoke, their attention sharpening as if they were collectively waiting for a cue they could not identify. Time moved on in measured seconds, and Daniel adjusted his stance, repeating himself in slightly different words, attempting to reassert the certainty that had begun to slip. Each repetition felt less like command and more like performance, and the difference did not go unnoticed by those watching closely. Alicia's calm took on a new quality in that pause, no longer simply restrained but resolute, grounded in the knowledge that control does not always announce itself when it changes hands. The night air felt heavier, not with threat but with anticipation, and ordinary sounds seemed distant, muted by the focus of the moment. Daniel's confidence wavered just enough to make him check his surroundings again, his eyes scanning for confirmation that had always been immediate in the past when none came. His jaw tightened, and the badge that had seemed so definitive moments earlier now looked like a question rather than an answer. Alicia remained still, her posture unchanged, aware that the most revealing moments often come not during confrontation but during the quiet after it, when assumptions are left unsupported. The crowd held its breath, sensing that the scene was no longer moving toward resolution but toward something undefined. Daniel spoke once more, his tone firm but strained, attempting to close the interaction through repetition rather than authority. And the effort itself signaled that something fundamental had shifted. Alicia waited, her patience unwavering, understanding that systems do not always respond instantly. But when they do, they leave no room for doubt. In that extended pause, the power dynamic hovered in suspension, no longer firmly in Daniel's grasp, yet not fully revealed, creating a silence that felt heavier than any raised voice. The calm before the change settled over the sidewalk, and although nothing outward had yet transformed, the sense that control was slipping grew undeniable, setting the stage for a moment when the invisible would finally become impossible to ignore. The change arrived without spectacle, slipping into the scene the way cold air finds its way through a closed door. Subtle at first and then impossible to ignore. Officer Daniel Reeves felt it before he understood it. A hesitation in the moment that did not belong to him. A pause that no amount of posture could correct. His radio, which had remained quiet longer than expected, suddenly came alive, not with reassurance but with clipped tones that carried none of the familiarity he relied on. He lifted it instinctively, expecting confirmation. Yet what came through did not align with the certainty he had projected only moments earlier. The words were formal, unmistakable, and stripped of flexibility, referencing protocols, identifiers, and an immediate change in status that required no interpretation. Daniel's expression shifted as the meaning settled in, confusion giving way to disbelief, then to a tightening awareness that something fundamental had changed. Around them, the crowd sensed it instantly, the collective posture of observers adjusting as if an invisible signal had passed through them as well. Alicia Carter remained still, her reaction minimal, not because she was unaware of what was happening, but because she had anticipated it with precision. She did not step forward or speak, allowing the system to assert itself without her assistance, trusting that clarity carried more weight when delivered impersonally. Daniel glanced down at his badge as if expecting it to contradict what he had just heard. But symbols do not argue when authority is withdrawn. Another transmission followed, confirming what the first had begun, referencing multiple divisions, layers of oversight, and an immediate suspension of operational control that extended further than he could have imagined. The realization hit him quietly, not as panic, but as a hollowing sense that the ground beneath his assumptions had disappeared. He tried to respond, his voice measured but uncertain. Yet the reply he received left no room for negotiation. The instructions were clear, procedural, and final, and they did not ask for his agreement. The crowd leaned in now, curiosity overtaking caution, phones rising again as the significance of the moment became undeniable. Daniel stood there, his authority unraveling in real time. Not through confrontation but through confirmation. The kind that arrives already documented and irreversible. Alicia met his gaze briefly, her expression calm, not triumphant, acknowledging the shift without exploiting it. She had never needed to raise her voice because the truth did not require amplification. The streetlight continued to hum overhead, indifferent to the reversal unfolding beneath it, while Daniel lowered his radio slowly, the weight of what had occurred settling across his shoulders. He was no longer directing the scene. He was being addressed by it. The badge that had anchored his confidence moments earlier now felt ceremonial rather than commanding. Its power dependent on recognition that had been formally revoked. Alicia remained exactly where she had been from the beginning. Her posture unchanged, embodying a composure that contrasted sharply with Daniel's visible recalibration. The crowd murmured softly, the sound no longer charged with tension but with recognition, as if they were witnessing a lesson rather than an incident. Daniel took a step back without realizing it, a physical acknowledgement of a shift he could not undo. And in that movement, the reversal became complete. Authority had not been taken from him by force or argument, but by a system responding precisely as designed. Alicia waited, allowing the moment to finish unfolding on its own, knowing that the most powerful revelations often speak for themselves when given the space to do so. The aftermath unfolded quietly, without raised voices or dramatic gestures, as the scene settled into a new order shaped by acknowledgement rather than force. Officer Daniel Reeves stood within the same circle of light, yet it no longer centered on him, and that realization weighed heavier than any command ever could. He listened as additional confirmations came through, each one precise, procedural, and unemotional, outlining next steps that did not include his direction or approval. The language was unmistakable, referencing oversight, internal review, and immediate reassignment, terms that left no space for interpretation. Daniel nodded once, a reflex more than a decision, absorbing the shift with a restrained composure that masked the unraveling beneath it. The crowd observed the change with a mixture of curiosity and quiet recognition. The tension that had drawn them in now transforming into a shared understanding that something had been corrected. Alicia Carter remained composed, her posture unchanged, allowing the system to complete its work without commentary. She did not step forward to claim the moment or explain herself, because the resolution did not require her narration. The streetlight continued to cast its steady glow, illuminating a scene that now felt less charged and more resolved, as if balance had been restored without announcement. Daniel glanced once more at his radio, then lowered it deliberately, acknowledging that the authority he had relied on was no longer his to exercise. The badge on his chest remained in place, yet its meaning had shifted. Stripped of the automatic deference he had assumed was permanent, he took another step back, this time consciously, creating space not out of command but out of necessity. The crowd responded subtly, their focus easing, some lowering their phones, others exchanging brief looks that spoke of relief rather than excitement. Alicia watched without expression, not because she felt detached, but because she understood that justice often arrived without spectacle, its impact measured in quiet recalibrations rather than visible triumphs. The consequences for Daniel were not dramatic in the way stories often portray, but they were thorough, extending beyond the moment into a process that would continue long after the sidewalk cleared. He listened as instructions outlined the path ahead, each step reinforcing that accountability was not optional or personal, but procedural and comprehensive. Alicia shifted her weight slightly, preparing to leave, confident that her presence was no longer required for the outcome to stand. She had trusted the system to respond appropriately, and it had done so with clarity. As she moved, the crowd parted instinctively, not out of fear or reverence, but out of respect for the composure she had maintained throughout. Daniel remained where he was, absorbing the reality that authority built on assumption could be dismantled through verification. Alone, the night resumed its ordinary rhythm, traffic sounds returning to the foreground, conversations restarting in hushed tones, the moment already transitioning into memory. Alicia walked away without looking back, her steps unhurried, carrying with her the quiet certainty that dignity did not need to be defended when truth was allowed to operate. Behind her, Daniel stood in the same light that had once amplified his presence, now revealing the difference between holding power and being accountable to it. The scene concluded not with confrontation, but with consequence, leaving behind a lesson etched not in raised voices or visible conflict, but in the unmistakable shift of who was recognized as legitimate. Justice had not arrived loudly, but it had arrived completely, and in its wake, the balance that had been disrupted was restored with a calm that spoke louder than any command. The night eventually released its hold on the sidewalk, returning the space to anonymity. Yet the meaning of what had unfolded lingered long after the crowd dispersed. Alicia Carter moved through the quiet streets with an unhurried pace, the city around her resuming its familiar rhythm as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Cars passed, traffic lights cycled, and distant voices blended into the background, ordinary sounds reclaiming the moment. To anyone who had not been there, it would have appeared like just another evening, another stretch of pavement beneath a streetlight. Yet for those who witnessed it, something fundamental had shifted. Alicia did not carry the weight of victory or the satisfaction of confrontation. Instead, she carried a calm certainty rooted in principle rather than outcome. She understood that justice, when it works as intended, rarely announces itself, preferring quiet correction over spectacle. Behind her, Officer Daniel Reeves remained with his thoughts, absorbing the reality that authority is not an inherent trait but a responsibility granted and withdrawn by systems larger than any individual. The absence of command felt unfamiliar, forcing him to confront the difference between control exercised and legitimacy earned. He replayed the moment in fragments, searching for the point where certainty had slipped away, only to realize that it had never truly belonged to him in the first place. The badge he wore still reflected light, but it no longer shielded him from accountability, and that distinction settled in with a clarity he could not ignore. Alicia continued on, her presence blending into the city, content to let the moment remain where it belonged, not as a story to be retold loudly, but as an example of how restraint and truth can reshape outcomes. She did not seek recognition, because recognition was never the goal. Balance was. The system had responded precisely as designed, confirming that authority grounded in assumption cannot withstand verification. Somewhere beyond the streets she walked, records were being updated, protocols reviewed, and processes set in motion that would extend far beyond that single encounter. Alicia trusted that continuity, understanding that real change often unfolds incrementally, through mechanisms that operate long after attention has moved elsewhere. Daniel, too, became part of that process. His experience reframed not as a public spectacle but as a lesson in the limits of unchecked power. The night air cooled as hours passed, and the streetlight eventually dimmed, its hum fading into the background of the city's endless motion. What remained was not a confrontation frozen in memory, but a quiet recalibration of how authority is recognized and how dignity is preserved. Alicia reached her destination and paused briefly, reflecting not on what she had endured, but on what had been corrected without her needing to demand it. She understood that the most enduring forms of justice leave no room for argument because they rely on structure, not emotion. Daniel would move forward as well, carrying the weight of accountability into a process that did not require her presence to continue. In that separation, the outcome felt complete, not because someone had won, but because a system had been compelled to function as intended. The lesson lingered in the silence left behind, clear and uncompromising. Power granted without scrutiny is fragile. Authority exercised without fairness is temporary. And dignity maintained in silence can shift outcomes more decisively than force ever could. The night closed without ceremony, yet the echo of what occurred remained. A reminder that justice does not always arrive with noise. But when it does arrive quietly, it often speaks the loudest.